We can all agree, I think, that poverty is multidimensional, that it's more than just an absence of income. But if that's the case, what are the dimensions of poverty we should be considering? Are they, as with the best measure that we have so far, the UNDP measure of multidimensional poverty? Is it deprivation with regards to education and health and living standards? Or are there other dimensions of poverty which are perhaps more important? If so, what are they? What sorts of dimensions might those be? And is it necessary to measure all of them? Or can we make do with a subset of dimensions and still get an accurate understanding of what poverty is? And the answer to that question, I guess, must reside in whether the nature of the relationships between those dimensions. Are they cumulative? Or in some sense, are some dimensions compensatory? The issue then becomes, those are crucially important issues for us as we think about how we measure poverty in all its forms and the contribution that the globe is making to reducing poverty in all its forms. But then, who do we turn to answer those complicated questions? Well, as Jeffrey began suggesting, we might as well ask those who are experts in those circumstances, people who experience poverty on a day-to-day basis. And in doing that, of course, we are very consistent with the UN's guiding principles on extreme poverty and human rights, which encourage us to engage people experiencing poverty in all aspects of the policy-making process. But there are other people who perhaps have a valid claim to know something about poverty. Practitioners who work alongside people experiencing poverty on a day-to-day basis. Academics, perhaps, who think theoretically about the concepts of poverty. Policymakers whose job it is to do something about it. And indeed the general public, who in many ways determine what policymakers do. We found it pretty difficult to engage those last two groups, but we have engaged the first three. And to cut a long story short, people experiencing poverty in 6 countries have taken the initiative to undertake research with the help of academics and researchers and practitioners. But they've taken the initiative to undertake research. 3 countries in the global south and 3 teams in the global north who have set out to provide answers to those questions which are inhibiting our policy-making process. And those teams have, broadly speaking, attempted to follow a 5-step model. The first step is to determine who they should talk to, those people who are experiencing poverty within their communities, but to reach beyond the people caught in normal surveys. Perhaps, for example, in Tanzania, to catch people whose job it is to break stones, or in Bangladesh, to reach the widows of farmers who were killed by tigers. The second step is to work with people experiencing poverty, to give them the confidence that people will listen to the things that they're saying, and the ability to respond to challenge in a group setting. To, in a sense, start to build a level playing field in which to engage in policy debate. And then people in poverty coming together, working together, starting with their own experience, but then engaging in a process of logical thinking about what the dimensions of poverty are and how they relate one to another. And we're not talking here about focus groups coming together for a few minutes. We're talking about a minimum of 8 hours of detailed discussion and reflection to reach conclusions about the nature of poverty. And in parallel, we have engaged with academics to think about their perspectives and those of practitioners too. And then taken representatives of all of those 3 groups to come together to find some consensual understanding of what it is we're prepared to call poverty. And in the weeks ahead, we're looking across those 6 countries to see whether there are common factors, common issues, which are applicable in those very diverse cultural and economic settings. And finally, researchers, together with people in poverty, are to think about how you might measure those dimensions. So that's, broadly speaking, the research that people in poverty have led on. What I'm going to report on their behalf is firstly work that we've done with working age people and the nature of poverty amongst those groups. But we recognise that poverty may be different, and we're also working with elders and children and young people to understand the dimensions of the poverty that they experience. Well, what are our emergent findings? And we are still doing the research, so these are not definitive. The first is reassuring for those of us who have been doing poverty research for 100 years. Lack of resources does indeed appear to be important, to be central. It's about the inability to make ends meet. So it's the use of those resources. And in those discussions, that debate about income and about resources has frequently been coupled with and explained by the direct consequences of that lack of resources, particularly the effect on physical and mental health. So in discussion with people in poverty, we're moving beyond thinking about poverty as the absence of physical objects, and to think about poverty as it's experienced by people. So poverty is felt. Poverty is observed through measuring objects, but it's felt through emotions. The emotion of shame, that sense of failure that society insists that you should feel because you're poor. The worry about how you're going to make ends meet. The fear of the consequences of not making ends meet. And a more existential fear about the nature of the future that you're moving into, which can lead to anxiety and clinical depression. There is also anger. Anger that society allows me to remain in the conditions in which I'm in. Anger that I am here, and that in some sense society tells me it's my responsibility. Anger from the child who sees their parent as the cause of the poverty that they are experiencing as children. And that inevitably sometimes leads to a sense of helplessness, perhaps. Although, of course, the people that we spoke to were survivors. Most important, perhaps, is that poverty is very clearly relational. At a group level, poverty is experienced as oppression, an absence of rights, an absence of opportunities. It's experienced as exploitation. Exploitation in the labour market, exploitation in other labour markets, exploitation that benefits us, those people who are not currently poor. Poverty is experienced on a day-to-day basis as humiliation. To be challenged and accused of sins of commission and sins of omission. To be blamed for the failure of our society as a whole, because poverty exists. And then there's dependency, forced to depend on the whims and the generosity of other people, and then accused of being dependent. So poverty ultimately moves towards social exclusion, that we push people experiencing poverty to the margins of our society and beyond. We define us and we see them as inherently different. They are the problem. That's how poverty is experienced at a group level. At an individual level, it's experienced as social isolation. The lack of resources that enable me to engage in the wider society in the way that I would want to. But also an unwillingness of people to engage with me because I am poor, and I must be poor for reasons that are something to do with a deficiency in my character. a process, therefore, of stigmatisation. Poverty is experienced at an individual level as discrimination. Discrimination on the basis of a lack of income, which restricts my access to services and to provisions. Discriminated because I haven't got the money and I can't be trusted because I don't have that money. And my ability to respond is very limited. I experience a lack of voice, an unwillingness of people to listen. I am voiceless. That's how I experience poverty. Poverty, as one might expect from the UDP index, is often coupled with poor education and poor health quality. But in our discussions, we've struggled and created a debate about whether these factors are intrinsic to poverty, essential for poverty, or whether they are causes of poverty or consequences of poverty, and whether those distinctions really matter. A final debate I want to share with you is a debate about whether poverty or dimensions of poverty can be in any sense positive. Poverty clearly is not positive. But people experiencing poverty acquire skills and knowledge. They acquire skills that enable them to survive in conditions that we couldn't survive in. They become resourceful in maximising the resources they can lay hold of and maximising the use to which those resources can be put. And that's linked to organisational skills. Any woman in this room knows the organisational skills to bring up a family. To bring up a family without resources is an altogether different challenge. But families are living and children are living. So those organisational things on resumes and curriculum vitae, they are hidden skills. And people in poverty want to be recognised. They would like a positive dimension to be included and thought about and measured. It's a challenge to those of us who see poverty purely, exclusively in negative terms. So the emerging findings are very consistent with the view that poverty is indeed multidimensional, multifaceted, and that's what people experience, not just the lack of income. And listening to people has encouraged us to rethink what it is we mean by poverty and what is our conception of the problem. A shift from an absence of material things to a recognition of the suffering of people, but not to stop there, to think about the response and resistance to that suffering that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Now, these new dimensions are currently, by definition, not measured, and we don't really understand the nature of the relationships between them, although that's what we're trying to tease out in the research that we are doing. But this lack of knowledge means that we have a partial understanding of the nature of poverty. And what that means, must mean, is that our measures are inadequate to measure progress towards poverty alleviation. And I guess too, that because we don't understand the phenomena that we're engaging with, our policies are likely to be ineffective and inefficient as a consequence. So we are advocating listening to people who really know, who live with the phenomena on a day-by-day basis.